You're watching Beyond Markets. Welcome, I'm Esther Awuni. Many thanks for joining us today. On the show, we'll discuss the recent changes in Nigeria's Mergers and Acquisition regulation. You can join the conversation as usual with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awuni. Now, Nigeria's Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission issued their first joint advisory and guidance on M&A activities following uncertainties around the passage of the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act. Zelda Akindele, partner at Templars, and Taiwo Oyedele, partner and West Africa tax leader at PwC Nigeria, join me for this discussion. Thank you so much, guys. It's good to have you on the show today. Now, the FCC, the Federal I know I'm going to be stumbling on that a lot in the course of the show, but let me get the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act is set to be, to be a welcome development, and is trying to ensure that in terms of fair competition in the business space in Nigeria, to make it a lot better. But before we go into highlights of the act, Taiwo, let me start with you. The current environment, why everyone is seeing this act as a much needed introduction?
Yeah, indeed. For me, I'll say the biggest component or aspect of this law, which for me it's welcoming, of course subject to a number of other issues around implementation, is the consumer protection bit.
Okay.
The competition one is fantastic, but I think, on a scale of, if I have to compare, I'll say the consumer protection aspect. If you think about it and you look at the market in terms of product, services, pricing, and all of that, you see a lot of substandard products. You see players, providers of goods and services, deliberately manipulating consumers. And sometimes when you then feel like the quality of what you get is not up to the price you pay, there's almost no recourse. So where do you go? Do you go to the court system? Can you afford it? So I'm hoping that the way we're going to implement this law will be such that even the ordinary person on the street, it's not just about large M&As, they're equally important, but also the person on the street who only has 1,000 naira to buy a product can be rest assured that they're paying for what they were promised, they're getting the right quality, and they will not put their life or health at stake by consuming something hoping that it was good. So that for me, it's very good.
Now, Zelda, let me ask you this. For, like Taiwo pointed out, substandard products and consumers just having the option to complain and reject, if they're not getting their money's worth. But we had the Consumer Protection. We had the Consumer Protection Council. We also have the likes of NAFDAC who, look at this product. So I'm wondering what went wrong, or where were the inadequacies, as it were?
So I don't necessarily think it's about anything going wrong, because as you rightly point out, we did have agencies that were pursuing, those areas as well. But to add to what Taiwo was saying, I think that the consumer protection and the competition regulation actually go hand in hand in a way, because the consumer protection, like you rightly said, individuals, the layman on the street, they're getting inferior products or being treated poorly. When you look at the intent behind the competition laws, competition provisions in the Act, you realize that it's actually a two-layer system, right? So the competition laws, for example, will address things like preventing monopolies, right? Monopolies are things that actually make consumer goods more expensive. It will prohibit restrictive agreements, which means that supply will spread around, for example, right? It will prohibit abuse of dominant market positions, for example, again. These are the sorts of things that, without the layman actually realizing, severely affect the pricing of their goods, the availability and supply of their goods. So I think it kind of goes hand in hand. So it's not that the agencies that we had before were necessarily inadequate, but perhaps they didn't have far and wide-ranging enough powers and scope to actually do what needed to be done. And in that regard, this is extremely welcome as some legislation.
So now this commission, the new commission, is going to work hand in hand with each of these agencies? So
this is the expectation.
Is that how it works?
But if you look at the provisions, right, this has actually, the provisions of this law have actually given the commission, that's the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission, precedence, and the Act precedence over all existing laws in that area. Right? So the expectation is that all of the agencies who are currently exercising those functions will continue to do so, but the FCCP will have that overarching purview, essentially, right? Because at the end of the day, you've mentioned some very specific areas like NDLEA, for example, that requires a certain expertise that they may not necessarily have at the commission, So they will work hand in hand, but ultimately they will take precedence.
Okay, Taiwo, because I asked Zelda that question because I want to know at what point will the Commission be required to comment, to step in the business of any of these agencies?
Yeah, what I would expect also, in addition to what has been said, is they have powers under this law to be able to issue regulations and guidelines. What I would expect them to do is to try and understand what is it that we currently have.
Okay.
What are the gaps, what are the shortcomings and weaknesses, and then come up with pretty much like a standard procedure. What is it that you have to do if this happens? Who is supposed to do your first point of call, and at what point should you then escalate, so that they, having the overarching power, are able to also regulate the people who are supposed to protect consumers and look at issues around competition. I had a personal experience in 2013, something that happened to me at the airport, MMA2, and I reported to the consumer protection guys. There was nothing forthcoming. I'm in court now, still 6 years after. So we have a lot of things in Nigeria that don't work. There's nothing that says, even though we think this law is much better than anything we had before, there's nothing that says it's going to work. So, but hopefully, we'll get to a point where we start thinking about, one thing we do very well in Nigeria is we measure inputs and efforts. You don't always measure outcome and results. Yeah? So this is an input, this is an effort. We have a law. But how much impact are we going to make? And being able to deliver on that also means you need to understand how is it that the existing agencies haven't been as effective as they could have been.
We'll come back to that, but let's go into one particular aspect of this law, Zelda, that is especially of concern to market participants here in Nigeria. That's mergers and acquisition. And interestingly, the Commission has been given very wide, oversight function, purview, as it were, over M&As. But help us understand what it is that will be different, or what they will be doing with M&As.
Okay, so prior to the enactment of the FCCPA, mergers and acquisitions actually came under the purview of the SEC, right, due to certain provisions in the Investments and Securities Act 2007. Now, the FCCPA has repealed those provisions, which means that they no longer apply, which means that SEC no longer has the authority to grant approval for M&A transactions. Under the Act, it moved... Any. That entire function was moved to the FCCPC now, right? But the Act came into force on the 30th of January, and there was no corresponding statement or immediate determinative action to tell the market, the FCCPC is now in charge. These are the new rules. And so there was a period of time where there was a lot of uncertainty in the market, actually. I mean, on a number of transactions that Templars were involved in, we had clients that were asking the question, what applies? Is it the old SEC rules or the FCCPC now? Even amongst that uncertainty, Templars were able to successfully execute certain transactions. For example, the Diamond Bank, Access Bank merger, we did it during that time of uncertainty. But luckily, or I would say most welcomely, on the 3rd of May, 2 Fridays ago, there was a joint statement from the FCCPC and the SEC saying, going forward now, FCCPC will have joint purview with SEC. So it's a joint statement, right? It's basically a transition period. What's going to happen now is that you will submit your merger or acquisition notification for approval to an FCCPC address. But at that address, you will have officers from SEC and FCCPC jointly reviewing. All right. But what I think is crucial for the markets to be aware of is that your process is going to be subject to the SEC rules and regulations around mergers. Well,
the
existing, yes, yes, and that's because the FCCP has not yet enacted any guidelines. They've not passed any rules as to how to do this. Some might say this still leaves us neither here nor there, but the reality is that the FCCPC at this time doesn't necessarily have the experience of approving or reviewing these transactions. So it is actually very welcome from the market perspective that SEC is still going to have a hand in it for some time, But the expectation is that sooner rather than later, the FCCP will come out with their own guidelines and rules, and then we have a better understanding of exactly what their regulations will be.
Now, Taiwo, PwC, you've looked at this very carefully, and you actually put out a short note to report on it, and you have some concerns when it comes to M&As for this new commission. Share them with us.
Yeah, so I think one of the things we had expected was that Nigeria should have thought about the transition. You don't just introduce a new law and say from now on it's a new body without dealing with how do you translate existing applications. You have new applications, and again, to the point she made, very valid one, issues around capacity and knowledge. These are not things you pick on the streets. Yeah, so this is something that even SEC themselves are taking decades to build the knowledge, and they're still working at it. They're not even there yet. So you don't want to lose all of that. What you want to do is to be able to build on it. So our take is it's a good development that we now have a joint statement. On one hand, it tells the market what needs to be done, but in terms of the existing applications and new ones, we don't want people to put everything on hold, waiting for government to come up with guidelines. And two, it seems to suggest that they're going to be working together. So hopefully maybe they would even move the personnel at SEC dealing with M&A to the new organization.
I'm just wondering what the input of the commission would be when you say they're going to be working together. If, for instance, to start working this week, for instance, and I'm just wondering what the input of the commission would be when on a particular issue, because they're still looking to the SEC for direction based on the already existing laws or rules that the SEC follows, and like you said, has taken years to master and to implement, as it were. And so that's my concern, one. Two, confidence of the market, who the market is looking to. When I know that if I'm a company, I'm going through an M&A, and I know that my papers are with the SEC, and I now know that there's a second party who's looking at my documents. What am I thinking? I'm thinking that, so what is the input of this second party? How is that going to affect the transaction? What does that mean for my business? Is there going to be something different? Should I expect a different outcome? I don't know. I'm just more uncertainties.
I think the two issues are connected. So SEC, there's nothing called SEC. They're just people who make up SEC, right? The same thing that you have the FCCPC now, and they don't even have the staff yet. They do not have the capacity. So if you imagine that what we have currently as part of the transition process is you have a team from SEC plus whatever team they have from the new agency working together, I think that should give the market the comfort that they're not dealing with people who are rookies and do not understand what it is that they're doing. And the whole idea would be that as quickly as possible, we ramp up the capacity of the personnel within the new agency such that they are as good, if not better, than the SEC.
Where would they be getting that knowledge from, capacity from SEC? So I'm wondering, so what's the difference? If you're learning from the guys on the ground, then what are you bringing to the table?
And if I can add to that, what they're actually bringing to the table is the fact that the new act, as we've already mentioned, is wider than the ISA provisions ever were for mergers and acquisitions, ever, right? SEC's function was something that it had to grow from experience, not necessarily because of what was in the legislation. Okay. So there were a number of gaps, a number of things that became market practice, for example, a number of things that we had to constantly seek guidance from SEC, which are now actually in the Act. I can give you some examples. For a very long time, for example, when we used to talk about a merger or a business combination, because of what was in the Act, it was taken by the market that this only referred to shares, excuse me, when there was a sale and acquisition of shares, right? But of course, as we know, you can have a merger and acquisition that involves an acquisition of the assets of a business, right? So somewhere down the line, SEC had to make that clarification to the market. In the Act, it's very clear. Shares, assets, it even goes as far as joint ventures.
So they will come and say, okay, this is what we're doing. We're looking at this differently and we're implementing this differently.
Exactly. So,
okay, Zelda, I'm afraid we're going to have to take a shot, but we'll come back and pick up from exactly where we left off. Thank you for your time so far on the show. I've been speaking to Zelda Akindele, partner at Templars, and Taiwo Oyedele, partner and West Africa tax leader at PwC Nigeria. If you're just joining us, Zelda Akindele, partner at Templars, and Taiwo Oyedele, partner and West Africa tax leader at PwC Nigeria, are with me today, and we're discussing recent changes in Nigeria's M&A regulation. Thank you so much for your time so far. Now let's pick up from where we left off. We're talking about M&As, but the powers of the Commission didn't stop there. There's also talk about there's also the inclusion of joint ventures. Taiwo, could you just help elaborate, just shed more light on that for us?
Yeah, so I think it's also about the point that Zelda made earlier on. So when you talk about competition and you're trying to protect consumers and all of that, you can't define it very narrowly. You're thinking a transaction about acquiring shares. There's a lot more. Because if you think about the principle, then you know that this can be done in many ways, more than one. So in a JV arrangement, normally, I know the one that comes to mind in Nigeria would be the oil and gas sector, but I think that would be the least of the troubles because you really don't need to go and regulate that for competition purposes because that's directly with government itself. So government is able to run that. But if you think about joint venture in other ways, between companies, so you may see something like laying a pipeline to do refining, transferring crude from the Niger Delta to Kaduna, for example, you could share that. We're beginning to see now that in the telecom sector, they're sharing their masts.
Okay.
So their telecom equipment. So you could also see organizations coming together to say, well, we can share personnel, we can share resources. In the process of doing that, if you don't monitor and regulate it, you could also exploit consumers. It could be in terms of pricing, it could be in terms of quality of product. So this is good, even though I think it's vaguely stated in the law. So hopefully the FCCPC will come up with guidelines and also learn from whatever it is that the SEC has been able to pick up from experience and then build on it. And also from what is being done elsewhere in the world. Because this is not entirely new to Nigeria, we're trying to just learn from others.
We'll talk about how we even came up about this law and this new act in the first place. Zelda, you're a lawyer. Taiwo talked about the risk of several or more than one interpretation to the JV side of it.
Yes, I think we're already seeing that in the market because there's a lot of commentary about whether or not the act applies to incorporated JVs or unincorporated JVs, because of course you can have both. Like you said, two companies can come together to build a pipeline. It's a joint venture, but you don't have an incorporated company, right? But the act doesn't specify. It simply says joint ventures, which from our perspective, when we look at it critically, I think what we have to consider is what is the intention of the act, right? And when you think about the intention of the act, it seems clear that it's not actually going to matter whether it's an incorporated JV or not unincorporated JV. What is going to happen is what is the effect of your joint venture? Right? So to the extent that the effect of your joint venture comes out anywhere on that spectrum that the FCCP has purview over, then you will fall within their regulation. I see no other way that it would be interpreted reasonably or for fair market purposes, because as Taiwo very clearly pointed out, there are several ways to skin a cat. So if you say it only applies to incorporated JVs, people will move to unincorporated and vice versa.
Yeah.
So I think we have to be looking at the legal effect, sorry, not legal, but the commercial effect of the joint ventures.
Okay.
Yes.
I was talking earlier about, how this act came about in the first place. Obviously, it was much needed and it's welcome, but just in terms of if we're taking a lift from another climate, another country, another region, what can you tell us?
Yeah, I don't know so much about where we got this from, but certainly it wasn't like Nigeria created it from scratch. I would imagine there's some guidelines and models by the OECD. You also have countries where they've done this ahead of everybody else, like the United States, like the EU, UK, for example. Maybe also look into South Africa, because within Africa, they seem to be ahead of the rest of us, especially if you see the quality of regulation they have, the size of their capital markets, and the commercial activities. Their entities are also mostly the largest in Africa, and a lot of M&A going on in that market. So I would imagine that this would have been a combination of learning from different countries, but whether this was specifically from a particular jurisdiction, that I do not know.
You are correct in that there was a lot of work that went into it in terms of pulling it together. But there are large parts of this that are based on the EU model, the EU regulations for competition law. It's not a lift, it's not a copy and paste of what they have, but certainly a lot of it is based on that model.
But for you, as a lawyer, looking at the way it's all been put together, the workability going forward, and like as we did say mention earlier, perhaps it's going to be a learning process, a learning curve also for the Commission. Are there parts of it that you consider to be significant in terms of how it's going to impact on competition in Nigeria, on protecting consumers in general?
I think the entire act is significant. I think that there is great potential for this act to actually transform the Nigerian markets on many levels in many ways. But what I think is probably more significant will be the implementation, how we actually execute it. And I think that there is a lot riding on this. The FCCP has a lot of work to do in the coming days in terms of the regulations, the guidelines that they put out, the training of the personnel, the interaction with the market to understand some of the things that have become market practice already and why. A lot of those things will all go into this implementation execution. And I think that is what is crucial to the success of this act.
But are you concerned, because when you mentioned training, because for me, that will be a sticking point, training of personnel. And I know that many of this, because for many of the, within the corporate sector, so many of the companies, and even, outside, like organizations like self-regulatory bodies like the Nigerian Bar Association, for instance, they also have oversight. And I'm wondering, so how do they work hand in hand with them? At what point would the NBA have to look to the commission, for whatever? So
one of the things that the Act does, as well as setting up the commission, is that it also sets up a tribunal. So we then have an FCCPC, right? The Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Tribunal. And one of the powers of that tribunal would be to hear appeals on some of the decisions taken by some of these bodies, for example, that you've referred to. So some of these bodies who have that sort of oversight within their sector have taken decisions and parties are unhappy with them or believe that they've been unfairly judged, then they can actually take them to the tribunal. So, there are a lot of layers and there's a lot to this act.
I know, it's a lot to take in.
And a lot of it is good, to be quite frank. A lot of it is unfamiliar, though, to our market, which is why I cannot stress enough how crucial the implementation will be.
Taiwo, your thoughts, going forward?
Yes, I think also, in terms of working with professional bodies such as the NBA, ICANN, and the rest of it, I think it should be collaborative. I see that in the law itself, it says to encourage them. So you want to work with them to try and help. Three things that for me probably stand out is one around the fines. So I was worried initially about, can somebody just come up and say, well, in the US, they levy $5 billion. Can we just do the same thing? So the law says not more than 10% of your turnover for the preceding year. Okay. And then the question I then have was, what if it's a new company? Or what if last year, there are companies that they're in business for 5 years and no turnover, if it's heavily capital intensive. So what do you then do? Does it mean we can violate and get away with it? There are also issues with price control. It allows the president to fix the price of certain products for a period of time. Hopefully, we will not abuse that. I wasn't very comfortable with that, but maybe there are reasons why that has been done. And the last one for me is the dispute resolution. And then Zelda already spoke about tribunal.
But I thought in some instances, where there's talk of an appeal court going to the appeal.
Yes.
That's after the tribunal.
Okay, that's
when Taiwo's done.
Okay.
Yeah. So the concern I have about the tribunal process itself is that it's subject to the regulation of the commission. So almost like saying, well, you can't just go to the tribunal unless the commission is happy with it, unless maybe you have a different interpretation. But that was my reading of the provisions of the law.
I think that a lot of this is going to depend on the regulatory philosophy that the Commission takes, to be frank. If they take a little bit of a more market-friendly approach, then it probably won't be the case. But of course, if they decide to take a very stringent, hardline regulatory approach going forward, then it will probably play out as you said. But to touch on the point around the appeal courts, etc., one of the things that is... I don't want to use the word peculiar, but perhaps a little bit unusual about this, is that there is a sense in which, and it comes up in various provisions in the Act, actually, that the Commission, the Tribunal, have been placed on the same level as the High Courts, the Federal Courts and the State High Courts. So, for example, where they have search and seizure powers, they can do it on the warrant of the Court of Appeal, I think it's on the High Courts, yes. But the appeals then go directly to the Court of Appeal. So you run into a slight constitutional issue there because their regulatory ambit's actually supposed to come within the purview of the Federal High Court. But what this law is telling us, though, is that they are the same as the Federal. They're putting it at par, which could be an issue depending on how they choose to play it out. So I think there's a lot to be seen in terms of the practical application.
And we're definitely keeping an eye on this one. Like you said, implementation is going to be key, and of course, it's obviously going to be a learning curve for the Commission itself, but we'll see how that goes. Well, thank you so much for your time today on the show. Thank you for being our guest today. I've been speaking to Zelda Akindele, a partner at Templars, and Taiwo Oyedele, he's a partner and West Africa tax leader at PwC Nigeria. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember that you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of Beyond Market on our website. That's cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Market, and you can follow my Twitter handle too at Esther O. Awoni. From myself and the team, it's bye for now.